They called her scope-dependent, laughed behind her back, and claimed she wouldn't last a single skirmish without her fancy optics. But one mission changed everything. 25 confirmed kills. No scope. No backup. Just raw instinct, iron sights, and something deeper than precision. A quiet storm of purpose no one saw coming. This is the story of how a soldier written off as a crutch-dependent technician rewrote every expectation and became a living legend in the most unexpected way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. No one really noticed Arla Voss when she first transferred into Echo Battalion. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy. She kept to herself and didn't try to fit in with the hyper-competitive swaggering that echoed through the barracks of Outpost 17. It wasn't that she was timid, just quiet. Too quiet, in fact, for a unit that thrived on visible dominance. In a culture of chest-puffing and locker room bravado, her silence felt like resistance. Or worse, weakness. But Arla wasn't weak. She just didn't see the need to prove something that hadn't yet been tested. She came from a support role in a long-range recon division, where she'd been known more for her technical precision than her physical aggression. There, she had made a name for herself as a reliable marksman, someone who could calibrate a scope to perfection and take down a target from half a mile away with one squeeze of the trigger. But that reputation didn't travel with her to Echo Battalion. Instead, it twisted. Somewhere between her personnel file and the whisper network of barracks gossip, her skill set became a punchline. "She can't shoot without a scope," someone joked. It stuck. Scope-dependent, they called her, and in Echo, nicknames were currency. Theirs was a brutal world, and branding someone with weakness was as good as painting a target on their back. Arla noticed. She wasn't naive. Every sarcastic chuckle that followed her to the firing range, every passive-aggressive suggestion that maybe she'd prefer to sit this one out if there were no scopes available, every time her requests for optic equipment mysteriously ended up at the bottom of the supply list, she noticed. But she didn't bite. She didn't argue or lash out or try to fight back in their language. She trained. Quietly. Obsessively. After hours. Alone. While the others partied or slept or bragged about the day's drills, Arla stood in the farthest corner of the shooting range, iron sights locked, muscle memory tightening like a coiled spring. To understand why she stayed silent, you'd have to know where she came from. Arla wasn't born into the military culture. She didn't grow up fantasizing about camo fatigues or target practice. Her childhood was spent in the dusty, quiet fringes of the Iskeron Plains, in a settlement so remote it didn't have a formal school or a clinic. Her father was a mechanic who fixed what couldn't be replaced, and her mother was a sharpshooter once, before she gave it all up to raise a family and grow barley on sunburnt land. Her mother taught her to shoot, not for glory or records or competition, but for survival. There were wild dogs and bandits and wolves that came down from the hills in the drought seasons. Arla never once used a scope. Just breath control, iron sights, and the unblinking patience of someone who couldn't afford to miss. In Echo, none of that mattered. History didn't count unless someone could Google it, and Arla didn't volunteer stories. The only thing they knew about her was what they chose to assume. And they assumed plenty. They assumed she had gotten her last assignment through favoritism. They assumed she didn't belong. They assumed she'd crack under pressure. And above all, they assumed she couldn't shoot worth a damn without an optic to cradle her confidence. The tension grew with each passing month. Arla's file showed competence, perfectly average performance in all group drills, unremarkable scores in simulations, nothing flashy. She was never chosen for high-stakes missions, always slotted as backup, or given monitoring duties. It was as if the system itself had quietly agreed to overlook her. And yet she never complained, never pushed. She simply watched, trained, waited. And then came Vargan Ridge. What started as a routine perimeter patrol turned into a full-blown ambush when the enemy, believed to be scattered and disorganized, launched a precision strike that split Echo Battalion in half. Communication lines dropped. Air support was scrambled but delayed. Panic buzzed through the comms, voices screaming half-formed orders, and chaos reigned across the dust-choked ridge. Arla wasn't meant to be on the front line that day, but as fate would have it, she was the only one in her unit whose comms didn't fail. Her old recon training meant she always carried analog backups. She picked up the panic in Sector 3, heard the code words, understood what was about to happen, and realized, with cold clarity, that she was the only one within reach of the assault point. No optics, no backup, no time. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the standard-issue rifle, irons only, and ran. What followed would become legend. But none of them knew that yet. All they knew was that the one they called scope-dependent had gone dark. And when the dust finally cleared, nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same again. Arla Voss was not built to impress at first glance. She stood at a modest 5'6", her wiry frame often swallowed up by the bulk of her standard-issue combat gear. Her skin was sun-worn, the soft bronze of someone who had lived more days under open sky than beneath any roof. Her dark hair was always tied back in a low, no-nonsense knot, and her gray eyes rarely lingered on anyone long enough to invite conversation. There was a steadiness in her presence, like the stillness of water just before a storm, a presence people often misread as passivity. Arla didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. And in the testosterone-fueled pressure cooker that was Echo Battalion, silence was often mistaken for weakness. She lived quietly on the outskirts of the barracks culture. While others competed for glory and stripes and nightly bragging rights, Arla moved through the routines with mechanical discipline. She woke before the bugle. She polished her boots and cleaned her weapon every day, regardless of whether or not she'd used it. She attended every drill, passed every assessment, and never once drew attention to herself. Her bunk was immaculately kept. Her meals were eaten quickly and alone. There were no pictures on her wall, no scribbles in her notebook, just lists, training notes, personal drills, wind speed estimates, distance tables, notes about pressure points and breath timing. Nobody ever asked her about them. They assumed she was just obsessively clinging to theory because she lacked real-world grit. What they didn't know was that Arla had seen combat long before Echo, just not the kind that came with medals or documented engagements. She had tracked raiders through sandstorms with nothing but a bolt-action rifle and her father's handmade compass. She had guarded livestock through the night, shooting by the light of a harvest moon to protect her family's only means of survival. In the frontier lands of the Iskeron Plains, combat didn't come with battle cries or explosions. It came in silence, in sudden movement, in the way a single shadow stretched too long across the horizon. It taught her to survive, to adapt, and to shoot with absolute certainty. But that kind of knowledge didn't carry weight in Echo. Not when it wasn't backed by official records or sanctioned kill counts. The only visible trace of her past was a small, worn ring she wore on a chain around her neck. It wasn't military issued. It wasn't ceremonial. Just a simple, weathered band of iron, the kind you might find buried in the dirt or passed down through quiet generations. Some of the others noticed it but never dared ask. They assumed it was sentimental nonsense. And in a world that valued domination over depth, sentiment was a vulnerability best left hidden. What Arla lacked in outward bravado, she more than made up for in technical brilliance. She understood firearms like an extension of her nervous system. Her hands could disassemble and reassemble a rifle in 30 seconds flat, even blindfolded. She adjusted for wind by instinct, calculated angles on the fly, and had a near photographic memory when it came to terrain. But again, none of that mattered in a unit built on immediate impact and measurable results. If you weren't loud, lethal, and visibly successful, you were considered background noise. She never challenged the system, not because she believed in it, but because she had seen what real survival looked like. Echo was a different kind of jungle, political, performative, full of noise and ego. Arla had grown up in silence, in the language of small decisions with massive consequences. She knew that most people underestimated what they couldn't categorize, and she let them. There was power in invisibility, power in letting others show you exactly how they thought the world worked before you turned it upside down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her first few weeks in Echo had been manageable. She'd kept her head down, did her work, and avoided unnecessary interactions. But by the third month, the murmurs began. Her former reputation as a long-range shooter made its way through the informal channels, twisted into something laughable. The girl who can't shoot without a scope. It started as an offhand joke during target drills and quickly evolved into a nickname, one that followed her like a mosquito in the dark. Scope dependent. It didn't matter that she had never once said she needed a scope. It didn't matter that she had passed every marksmanship qualification clean. In a battalion that thrived on dominance, any sign of specialization was treated like a flaw, especially if it came from someone they didn't fear. And yet, Arla absorbed it all, not with indifference, but with a kind of measured patience. She knew the nature of predators. They watched for weakness, circled it, tested it. But the moment you showed teeth, real, unshakable teeth, they scattered. Arla wasn't going to win their respect by complaining or proving herself in their chosen arena. No, she was waiting for the arena to come to her. Outside of training hours, she quietly requested access to the old quartermaster range, the one no one used anymore because it was manually calibrated and lacked the digital targeting systems most soldiers relied on. She practiced late at night, using iron sights only, varying her positions and distances until her hands worked independently of her eyes. Muscle memory, breath control, time dilation. Every shot was another brick laid in a silent wall she was building, not to keep them out, but to keep her foundation unshakable. She wasn't preparing for vengeance. Arla didn't care about revenge. What she cared about was truth, the kind that didn't need explanations or justification, the kind that was undeniable when witnessed, the kind that couldn't be laughed off or erased with another nickname. And she knew, sooner or later, the truth would come knocking. And when it did, it wouldn't ask for permission. It would demand presence. And Arla Voss would be ready. Echo Battalion operated out of Outpost 17, a brutalist structure etched into the scorched foothills of the Red Scarp region, a place where dust hung in the air like fine ash and sunlight hammered down without apology. The compound was a fortress in every way that mattered. Reinforced walls, automated turrets, biometric gates. But what kept most enemies at bay wasn't the steel or the guns. It was the land itself. Jagged cliffs and unpredictable valleys made approach difficult, and the only safe paths in or out were narrow, winding trails that could collapse under the wrong kind of pressure. It was a place built for hardship, a crucible meant to burn away the weak and forge steel out of those who survived. Inside, the atmosphere was no less intense. The barracks were stripped down and utilitarian, all concrete floors and metal cots, with no room for comfort or quiet. Noise filled every crevice, boots stomping, men barking orders, the ever-present thud of weight sets and gunfire from the range. The mess hall buzzed with a tense sort of energy, like a room full of coiled springs, every conversation teetering on the edge of challenge or confrontation. It wasn't camaraderie that held Echo together. It was a shared thirst for validation. Each soldier fought not just for mission success, but for rank, recognition, and the fleeting high of proving someone else wrong. The outpost was segmented into different operational zones. The command center with its endless screens and tactical maps, the drone tower where surveillance feeds flickered day and night, the gear depot constantly churning out requisition errors, and the motor yard where broken-down transports sat in half repair. Then there was the range, both digital and analog. The newer facility was sleek and sensor-driven, used mostly for simulations and qualifying rounds. The old range, which Arla preferred, was farther out toward the ridgeline, surrounded by rocky outcrops and layered wind currents. It was neglected, outdated, and beautiful in its simplicity. Here, variables couldn't be programmed away. You had to feel them, adjust in real time. This was where Arla trained, always alone, always silent, her bootprints the only ones marking the dust. Beyond the physical layout, the social structure of Echo was its own battlefield. There were three dominant factions among the troops: the Stormmen, known for their aggressive tactics and physical domination on the field; the Slicers, elite in their speed and recon maneuvers; and the Vultures, a shadowy group more focused on tech and drone strikes, rarely engaging in direct combat but holding significant influence because of their results. Arla didn't belong to any of them. She was an outsider, not just in personality but in alignment. She'd never been recruited into one of their circles, nor had she shown interest in joining. This made her a threat, not in power, but in potential. In a place where every soldier played a part in a delicate hierarchy of reputation, someone who refused to play was either irrelevant or dangerously unpredictable. Her living quarters sat in the far corner of the barracks, next to the storage wing and away from the common areas. She preferred it that way. While the others argued over night shifts or swapped stories of conquest, Arla spent her evenings cleaning equipment, reviewing mission footage, and recalibrating every piece of her kit. She didn't watch the feed like most did for entertainment. She studied it like scripture. Every movement, every mistake, every hesitation was dissected. Not because she was obsessed with perfection, but because survival wasn't theoretical to her. It was procedural. You had to know yourself as intimately as you knew your target. Otherwise, the bullet wasn't the only thing at risk. Training days were brutal. The dry heat of the Red Scarp region had a way of clinging to your skin, draining your stamina with every passing hour. Windstorms could roll in without warning, and dust would fill your lungs like powdered cement. Despite the harsh environment, the standards never dropped. In fact, they often rose. There was an unspoken rule at Echo. If you weren't getting better, you were falling behind. It bred a climate of relentless ambition, but also paranoia. Trust was scarce. Friendships were brittle. Most alliances were transactional, formed out of convenience or necessity, not loyalty. In this kind of space, someone like Arla, quiet, unreadable, and disinterested in tribal politics, was more than just an outsider. She was a variable. And in a tightly controlled equation, variables made people nervous. The officers weren't much better. Lieutenant Graydon, who ran the battalion with the sharp efficiency of a machine, rarely spoke to anyone who wasn't in the top percentile of his reports. He didn't dislike Arla. He barely acknowledged her. To him, she was filler, someone who showed up, completed assignments, and didn't cause problems. In a way, that invisibility was a blessing. It allowed her to operate under the radar. But it also meant, when mission assignments came down, she was rarely considered for anything that required visible impact. No heroics, no spotlight, just routine patrols and the occasional logistics run. It was frustrating, yes, but Arla didn't need the validation. She wasn't here for attention, she was here for the work. And maybe, somewhere deep down, for the reckoning. The surrounding terrain of the outpost added to the constant pressure. The Red Scarps weren't just barren. They were dangerous. Valleys could collapse without warning. Dust devils rose from cracked earth and blinded scouts. And worst of all, the enemy, known as the Rask Syndicate, had grown smarter over the past year. They no longer relied on brute force. They were agile now, splintered into cells, using the environment like a weapon. They'd learned to cloak their movements in sandstorms, to reroute patrols with falsified drone signals. Echo was at war, but it was no longer a war of straightforward firepower. It was a war of nerves, deception, and adaptability, and that was where Arla thrived. She didn't rely on structure or tech. She relied on instinct, precision, silence. Outposts to the 17th of May have looked like concrete and steel to most, but to Arla it was something else entirely. It was a pressure chamber, a forge. And deep inside its walls, something was slowly being tempered. A reckoning not just for the Rask Syndicate, but for everyone who had mistaken her stillness for surrender. The world she lived in didn't ask questions, it made assumptions, but soon it would learn to listen, whether it was ready or not. In a battalion like Echo, enemies didn't always wear different uniforms. Some of the most corrosive forces wore the same fatigues, saluted the same flags, and shared the same mess hall. Arla had long learned that conflict wasn't always about gunfire and hostile coordinates. Sometimes it was about silence laced with smirks, about orders delayed on purpose, or promotions that mysteriously never came. And in Echo Battalion, the man who embodied that quiet, insidious opposition was Staff Sergeant Daxon Creel. Creel was a battlefield bruiser, molded by frontline chaos and sharpened into a man who saw weakness in anything unfamiliar. With a broad chest, buzzed scalp, and a stare that carried a permanent challenge, he commanded respect, or at least fear, without needing to raise his voice. His combat record was impeccable. Dozens of successful engagements, multiple commendations for field leadership, and a long list of confirmed kills, most of them earned up close. He was known for leading with brute force and for favoring aggression over strategy. His motto, spoken half in jest and half in warning, was break it or burn it. And in a place like Echo, that made him a hero to many. To Creel, people like Arla were an irritation, an anomaly that defied his worldview. She wasn't loud enough, didn't brag enough, didn't bleed openly for the battalion's camaraderie rituals. Worse, she didn't crumble under pressure or react to provocation. And that silence, that stillness, got under his skin like grit in a wound. He saw it as disrespect, insubordination masked as humility. From the moment Arla arrived, Creel watched her with the cold curiosity of a man dissecting a puzzle he didn't ask for. She didn't fit into any box he respected, wasn't a bruiser like the Stormmen, didn't buzz with the energy of the Slicers, and had no use for tech like the Vultures. She was neutral, and to someone like Creel, neutrality was the same as weakness. He began small, with sarcasm, public jabs during briefings. Quips like, "Hope we got enough batteries for your scope, Voss," or "Don't want to strain your eyes out there, better get your glass." The laughter that followed was performative, almost obligatory. Echo was a pack culture, and Creel was an alpha. No one wanted to be outside the joke. But Arla never flinched, never looked away. She simply acknowledged the words with the faintest nod, or, worse, no reaction at all. That infuriated him. His ego thrived on visible impact, and her lack of response chipped away at his patience. It didn't stop there. On training days, Creel would assign her the dullest roles, repetitive drills, gear inspections, and low-tier observation posts. He made sure she rarely saw field simulation time and almost never worked in pairs. When she did get range time, the scopes were missing, the ammo was mismatched, or the targeting modules malfunctioned. Always a coincidence, always untraceable. And through it all, Arla never filed a complaint, never called him out, never gave him the satisfaction of escalation. But while Arla endured it all with unshakable calm, others were watching, some with amusement, others with unease. Private Joran, one of the younger recruits, once tried to step in, offering her an extra scope on a particularly windy drill day. Creel had chewed him out in front of the entire firing squad, warning that, quote, "Coddling isn't part of Echo's discipline." Joran never approached her again. No one did. The message was clear: siding with Arla would cost you. Creel didn't just dislike her, he actively resented what she represented. To him, the battlefield was sacred, forged through hardship, blood, and dominance. Arla's quiet, surgical precision, her refusal to grandstand or chase approval, flew in the face of that philosophy. And more than that, she posed a silent threat to his authority. Creel ruled by example and fear. Arla ruled nothing, sought no loyalty, and yet she endured. She kept showing up, kept performing, kept improving. It was the lack of ego that unnerved him most. In a world where every soldier elbowed their way to the front of the line, Arla stood back and watched. She didn't need attention. She didn't demand recognition. And somehow, that made her more powerful than the loudest soldier in the room. Creel knew that. And, like any threat he couldn't control, he planned to erase it before it could grow. Behind the scenes, Creel began manipulating the mission board, influencing which names made it onto critical assignments. Arla's name never appeared on recon logs, never on combat patrols, and certainly never on joint task engagements. She was boxed in, pushed to the sidelines. But what he hadn't accounted for was her ability to thrive there. The more he buried her, the more she trained. She requested night drills, took extra equipment maintenance rotations. She volunteered for long watch posts that others avoided. She started logging solo hours in the analog range long after the others had called it a day, and every round she fired from iron sights tightened a grip she never showed. It wasn't until the Vargan Ridge situation began to build that the cracks in Creel's command started to show. Intelligence indicated that RASC activity was increasing in the eastern sector, but Creel dismissed it, citing outdated recon. When Arla submitted a quiet observation report noting unusual signal patterns, flagging an intercepted transmission that suggested imminent movement, he had it buried under routine paperwork, called it ghost noise, and told Commander overanalysis was proof she belonged in logistics, not combat. He grinned when he said it, sure that no one would challenge him. But the RASC weren't ghost noise. And when they hit Vargan Ridge, it wasn't a minor skirmish. It was a calculated ambush, perfectly timed, surgically executed. Creel's overconfidence shattered within the first 10 minutes of the breach. Half of Echo was cut off. Command lines went dark. Air support was delayed due to a miscommunication. Another link in the growing chain of mistakes Creel had helped forge with his arrogance. And in the middle of it all, one soldier, unassigned, unnoticed, and unscoped, picked up on the faintest distress signal. Arla Voss heard the storm before anyone else saw it. And without permission, without orders, and without the crutch they mocked her for, she moved straight toward the fire. Creel wouldn't understand it until it was too late. But the ghost he tried to bury was already writing the beginning of his end. By the time the sun began to break through the misty ridges of the Harrow Valley, Celine had already been awake for hours, her breath visible in the cold morning air as she trained her rifle in silence, practicing her breathing, her grip, and the alignment of the iron sights, until every movement became instinctive. Her hands, once clumsy and unsure, now moved with mechanical precision, driven not just by a thirst for technical mastery, but by a fire that came from every insult, every dismissal, every time someone had called her scope-dependent, like it was a slur. Training alone had become her ritual, her way of stripping away the noise of doubt and replacing it with silence sharp enough to cut through metal. While others partied or joked around in the mess hall, Celine was in the wind-swept hills or inside the derelict factory grounds, sighting at distant targets through naked iron, marking her own progress in chalk across the inside of her tent flap. And as the routine became her rhythm, something within her began to shift. She no longer flinched at her own name during debriefings. She no longer tensed up when hearing others talk about her behind her back. She just let it fuel the engine that drove her to push harder. The iron sights, once the symbol of her perceived inadequacy, had become her badge of rebirth. Major Farrow, who had initially kept his distance from her training after the humiliating simulation, started paying attention. It began with glances, quick, assessing looks from across the courtyard. Then came casual check-ins, nothing more than logistical questions at first. But Celine noticed. Everyone noticed. She was being observed again, but not as a liability. She was being watched for results. He would drop by as she was completing timed target runs and make no comment, simply noting the score on her board, nodding almost imperceptibly when she beat her own record. What began as silent acknowledgement gradually became something closer to respect. One day, during a break in drills, he handed her a clip of fresh rounds and said, "Try adding some recoil to your run. Let's see how you manage under fire." Celine took the challenge without hesitation and moved through the course with deadly grace, hitting every marker, her iron sights aligned like a scalpel. Pharaoh said nothing afterward. He didn't need to. By week 3, the murmurs around camp had begun to shift. The ridicule had dulled into wary curiosity. No one dared say the nickname aloud anymore, not because it wasn't true, but because it no longer held power over her. She had reclaimed it, turned it inside out. New recruits, too green to know her history, began seeking her out for tips on close-range engagements. Some even stood beside her during morning drills, mimicking her stance and mimicking her breathing. Celine didn't respond much, but she let them stay. A quiet camaraderie grew in those early hours, forged not from loud speeches or bravado, but from sweat and repetition. And although she never sought leadership, she became one, not in rank, but in example. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed by HQ either. A message came through the encrypted comms. She was being considered for a special insertion team, Operation Emberlight, a classified mission requiring agile, unorthodox shooters capable of navigating tight corridors and low-light environments where optics often became more a liability than an advantage. Her inclusion was a shock to some, a relief to others. But to Celine, it was simply the next step. When she received the mission outline, she didn't smile, didn't brag. She just nodded and began preparing in silence. The irony was not lost on her. The mission that would test her mettle wasn't one that required advanced gear or elite sniper equipment. It required exactly what she had spent the last month mastering: precision without augmentation, seeing without lenses, reacting on instinct alone. As the date drew near, her squad began forming. Surprisingly, she wasn't placed with any of her usual unit mates. Instead, she was assigned to a mix of elite soldiers and fringe operators, individuals known for either brilliance or unpredictability. The kind of soldiers whose reputations preceded them like storm clouds. Among them was Refe Cortez, a demolition expert with nerves of steel and a chaotic tactical style, and Jun Park, a former scout sniper who once navigated 3 miles of enemy terrain without a single assist. When they first met, Rafe gave Celine a long, thoughtful look and muttered, "You're the one who ditched scopes." She simply nodded, and to her surprise, Rafe cracked a grin. "Takes guts. Let's see if that pays off." Jun, on the other hand, remained unreadable, offering a curt nod before diving into mission briefings. The team dynamic was tight, not from familiarity, but from mutual respect and the unspoken understanding that only performance mattered now. Celine studied the blueprints of their target zone obsessively in the days leading up to the drop. The Emberlight facility was buried beneath layers of ruin in a collapsed metro line, rumored to be swarming with rogue AI drones and ex-mercenary holdouts. Night vision wouldn't always function down there due to electromagnetic interference, and scopes were next to useless in such cramped, disorienting spaces. For once, her skill set wasn't a compromise, it was the ideal. And for the first time since that humiliating simulation, Celine felt the faintest flicker of excitement course through her. On the eve of deployment, as they loaded their gear into the carrier dropship, Pharaoh pulled her aside. He didn't say much, just handed her a fresh, iron sight-optimized rifle, its stock worn but balanced perfectly. This one belonged to Sergeant Vale. She went through hell with it, and made it back more than once. "You're the first I've trusted enough to carry it." Celine accepted it with reverence. gripping the weapon like it was a continuation of herself. She didn't respond with thanks, only a slight nod, then turned toward the hangar ramp. Ahead was darkness, concrete labyrinths, and the test of everything she had rebuilt from the ground up. Behind her were the whispers and the doubts. But those no longer followed her. They had become ghosts, left in the dust of her rise. The day of the annual tournament arrived, and though the morning sun cast a golden hue across the training field, there was a palpable tension in the air. The registration tent buzzed with noise, gear clinking, names being shouted, strategies whispered, rivalries rekindled. But above the noise and chaos, one name had already started to circulate, not as a threat, not as a champion, but as a joke. Ray. Scope-dependent Ray, they called her. The girl who flinched when her optics weren't pristine. The girl whose previous kills were dismissed as flukes propped up by gear. The girl whose name was associated more with fragile routines than deadly consistency. But Ray wasn't there to argue, or to listen. She stood quietly at the edge of the lineup, iron sight rifle slung low on her shoulder, eyes fixed on the towering rocky hills where the first round would unfold. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her breath was steady. This wasn't about being better than someone anymore. It was about being better than she used to be. And she had promised herself she would finish the fight with no excuses and no apologies. The rules were simple: 3 days, 10 scenarios, 100 competitors, and a series of challenges designed to push reflexes, decision-making, and adaptability to the edge. Each scenario was graded not just on kills, but on how they were achieved: stealth, precision, timing, courage. Ray had studied them all. She had replayed past tournaments in her mind and cross-referenced maps until she knew every contour of the terrain, like a memory from childhood. She also knew where she'd likely be at a disadvantage: open terrain with no elevation, long-range sightlines where scopes would rule, but that only meant she had to be faster, smarter, and more patient. Her first test came quickly: a simulated village clearing, hostiles hidden within buildings and alleyways, requiring each contestant to clear the area without backup. Ray knelt behind a barrel at the entrance of the first structure, heartbeat slowing as she let her ears do the work. 1 breath. 2. A footstep above. She adjusted, raised her rifle, no scope to guide her, just instinct and training, and fired. Clean. She moved on. 6 confirmed eliminations later, she was the only one in her bracket to clear the area without a single miss. The field officer raised an eyebrow when logging her score, but said nothing. Ray didn't expect praise. She expected disbelief, and she was fine with that. Word spread slowly through the encampment that night. A few chuckled when they heard Ray was still in it, but the tone shifted when they heard how. Iron sights only. Perfect run, no assist tech. Some claimed it was beginner's luck, others whispered sabotage or setup. Ray ignored it all. She sat beneath a battered lamppost in the outer circle of camp, quietly cleaning her rifle, brushing her fingers across the cool metal, tightening a single screw near the trigger she'd almost overlooked. Every little part mattered now. There was no fancy lens to cover her mistakes, no magnification to mask a hesitation. It was her eyes, her nerves, her breath, and that faint tug of steel. By the second day, the competition halved. Ray stood at the new deployment line alongside the remaining 48. Gone were the casual chatter and chest-thumping bravado. What was left were seasoned players, many of them veterans in the sim circuit, some of them retired military, others engineers with twitch reflexes that danced faster than light. But none of them used iron sights. All of them had their scopes polished and tuned, crosshairs dialed to perfection. Ray saw a few side eyes, subtle smirks, one man audibly scoffing and muttering something about nostalgia cosplay. She smiled to herself. The more they laughed, the more they underestimated her. And that was an advantage, all on its own. The second scenario was a canyon standoff: limited cover, unpredictable AI enemies, timed extraction. Ray had to move fast, think faster. The field was dusty and bright, scope users ducking behind every boulder, zooming in, tracking movement from a distance. Ray, low and agile, used elevation differently. She read shadows, heard echoes, tracked breaths. Twice, she outmaneuvered her opponents not by outshooting them, but by predicting their rhythms. When one enemy crept forward to adjust his bipod, she moved laterally and used the recoil of his own shot to locate his position. Her iron sight blinked, her finger pressed, and he fell without ever seeing her. By the end of the challenge, Ray notched 5 more eliminations, one of the highest of the day. Some of the officers reviewing the footage looked at each other and frowned. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. That night, a new kind of whisper passed through the camp. No longer disbelief, but confusion, curiosity. People had reviewed the tapes and realized Ray's precision wasn't random. Her shots weren't wild or desperate. They were deliberate, almost surgical. A few of the competitors started eyeing her rifle, wondering if it was rigged or modified, but the inspections confirmed it was legal. Bare-bones standard, no enhancements, no auto-lock, no recoil compensator, just metal and skill. By the time Ray lay down to rest, she was starting to feel it in her bones. Not fatigue. No, she trained past that weeks ago. But wait. The weight of momentum, the realization that every step forward meant more eyes watching, more expectations, more pressure. But she didn't let it scare her. Pressure was just another kind of terrain, and like every battlefield, it could be mapped, measured, and mastered. As the third and final day approached, Ray knew the next scenarios would test everything. Close quarters panic, long-distance threading, team simulations where betrayals weren't just likely but encouraged. She stared at the stars that night, rifle across her lap, and whispered a quiet truth to herself. She had already changed the way people looked at her, but the mission wasn't done. They still didn't believe she could win, and nothing burned brighter in Ray's chest than the fire that came when people said, "You'll never," because she had already turned never into not yet, and she was about to turn not yet into now. The turning point came sooner than anyone expected. The next tournament on the circuit, the Dominion Open, was held in the heart of the city's high-stakes gaming arena, a venue that buzzed with anticipation and pressure. It wasn't the biggest tournament of the year, but it was televised, heavily streamed, and boasted a lineup of elite-tier competitors. For Quinn, this was the perfect proving ground. No one from her team pushed her to enter. It was a decision she made quietly, without consulting Nash or Rena. She signed up under her usual handle, Iron Rain, and when the official bracket was released, her name was barely noticed among the heavyweights. The only ripple was in one of the gaming forums where someone remarked, "Isn't that the scope-dependent girl?" followed by a laughing emoji. That thread died quickly, buried beneath discussions of more serious contenders. What they didn't know was that Quinn had been spending nearly every waking moment sharpening her skills, on her own, in silence, without attachments. She had stripped herself of every crutch and immersed herself in pure gameplay. No HUD, no aim assist, no enhanced scope visuals. Just raw skill and a relentless drive to win, to prove not to the world but to herself that she could do this. Her mind was sharper than ever. Her awareness, timing, positioning, and recoil control had evolved into something deadly. Every mistake she used to make had been dissected and accounted for. Every hesitation she once had was now replaced with measured confidence. When the matches began, the early rounds were relatively easy. Not because her opponents were weak, far from it, but because Quinn had ascended to a level of fluidity that made her moves unpredictable. She wasn't flashy. She didn't go for unnecessary trick shots or crowd-pleasing antics. She played clean, calculated, brutally efficient. Her first opponent, a mid-ranked streamer with a loyal following, didn't even realize what had hit him. Quinn's kill count in that match was double his. She moved through corridors and open maps like a ghost, never where she was expected, always one step ahead. Commentators brushed it off as beginner's luck or the advantage of being an unknown. In the second round, she faced two-time finalist Sprox, who underestimated her from the get-go. That underestimation cost him dearly. Quinn picked him apart piece by piece, using only iron sights. When he realized she wasn't using any scopes or visual assist gear, he tried to mock her mid-match. But the scoreboard didn't lie. She won the set cleanly and moved on. That was the first time someone actually paused to say her name on stream. Iron reigns. Interesting, one of the commentators said, uncertain. Is she seriously running no optics? The question stirred speculation online, and the forums began to buzz again. Some assumed it was a gimmick. Others began pulling old footage of her past failures to craft memes and jokes. But a few, those who understood gameplay mechanics at a deeper level, started to pay attention. She's compensating with better tracking and timing, someone wrote. She's not aimless. She's deliberate. By the time she reached the quarterfinals, Quinn had drawn the attention of Nash and Rena, who were both watching the matches on their own. Neither of them had spoken to her since the fallout weeks ago, but seeing her dominate the competition, all without the fancy upgrades they used to insist on, was humbling. Nash, especially, stared at the screen in disbelief. He watched her turn what should have been a losing position into a stunning flanking maneuver. Her decision-making had matured, her movements economical yet devastating. For the first time, he saw what she had been trying to show them all along. The match before the semifinals was against a player named Jade Kai, known for aggressive tactics and pushing players into panic. But Quinn didn't panic. In fact, she baited him into overcommitting, leading him into a crossfire trap she had set up, using environmental awareness alone. No gadgets, no assists, just pure tactical superiority. She won that set with the cleanest kill-to-death ratio in the tournament so far. The crowd began to shift from amused curiosity to genuine awe. Chat rooms flooded with comments like, "Is she the real deal?" and "Iron Reign's iron sights are deadly." Backstage, Quinn stayed quiet. She didn't check the threads, didn't watch the replays. She focused inward, meditating between matches, controlling her breathing, replaying mental simulations of likely scenarios. Her controller sat beside her, worn from hours of daily use, the grips slightly frayed at the edges, a silent testament to her grind. As she entered the semifinal round, the energy in the arena had changed. People were cheering her name now, not mockingly, but with rising excitement. Her opponent, Hallowfade, was ranked top 5 nationally and had never lost a match in the Dominion Open. He wore high-end gear, a visor display calibrated to headshot targets, and a custom-built loadout optimized for kill speed. Quinn had none of that. But she had anticipation. She had hours of invisible, grueling work. She had iron. The match was intense, stretching into overtime rounds. Hallowfade's movements were quick, but Quinn's were smarter. She used terrain, shadows, sound cues, and outmaneuvered him. The crowd was stunned. By the end of the match, Quinn stood victorious. No flashy celebrations. She simply nodded once and walked off the stage. But backstage, people moved to make room for her. Heads turned. There were whispers now, not of mockery but respect. She wasn't scope-dependent anymore. She wasn't even just Iron Reign. She was the player who rewrote the rules. The air in the tent was thick with tension as Mara laid out the iron sight rifle on the table, her hands steady but her mind racing. Just 3 days until the qualifying run, and every fiber of her being buzzed with the weight of what lay ahead. The elite shooters would be watching, the brass would be scoring, and the mocking eyes of her squad mates, especially Pharaoh, would be fixed on her every move. She wasn't just fighting to prove she could use iron sights. She was fighting to be seen, heard, and respected in a world that had written her off. Each night, Mara reviewed footage of past training runs, watching frame by frame where her aim faltered or her posture sagged. She scoured message boards and manuals written by long-retired marksmen digging deep into the techniques of those who had mastered shooting without assistance. One post stuck with her: "Iron sight shooting is not about the target. It's about trusting your eye-hand connection more than your equipment." That line looped in her mind as she worked through her drills, forcing herself to build an instinctive awareness of distance, movement, and breath control. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't flashy. But it was something only the deeply dedicated could ever fully learn. That's what kept her going. That, and the words of her mother echoing like a ghost she never asked for: "They won't believe in you until you leave them no choice." In those late-night sessions, while others slept or played cards, she trained under the pale hum of overhead lights. The camp shooting range had long closed by then, so she set up makeshift silhouettes made from crate lids and duct tape near the mess hall, far enough not to disturb anyone but close enough to dash away if she drew too much attention. Each night she hit a dozen of them, running the course with nothing but her iron sight carbine and her breath in her ears. Every shot whispered to her, "You're getting closer." But while she gained skill, the mental warfare intensified. During a tactical simulation, Mara's unit was split into 2 fire teams for a mock hostage extraction. Pharaoh was appointed squad lead and instantly chose the scope users for his team, sending Mara to the dummy squad, as he called it, with a half-smile. "Iron sights in a hostage run? Let's hope you're aiming at cardboard," he said, loud enough for the others to chuckle. She didn't rise to it. She couldn't. Instead, she ran her role in the simulation with brutal focus, making every corner count, every move purposeful. And when the final buzzer sounded, it was Mara's team that completed the objective with fewer misses. The instructors noted it. They didn't say much, but a few eyebrows rose. Pharaoh's smile waned for a moment, and that moment fueled Mara like high octane. Still, praise was never direct in this world. Not for someone like her. She returned to her cot that night, not with congratulations, but with a quiet, inner knowing that she had edged closer to undeniable. In between training sessions, Mara grew close to Io, a silent but sharp shooter from the Sierra Division. Io had come up under harsh conditions, too, though his battlegrounds were different: jungle terrain and zero tech support. He noticed her discipline and offered feedback without ego, teaching her a few tips he'd learned while hunting in the mangroves back home. "You want the barrel to feel like it's pointing from your soul, not your shoulder," he said once, tapping her chest lightly. "The weapon is not yours. It becomes you." They trained together in secret, twice a week. It became the only time Mara felt like someone believed in her without waiting for her to fail first. Io told her about his first iron sight kill, a 700-meter shot through brush during a rebel sweep, and that lit something primal in her. Not jealousy, not awe, but a raw sense of possibility. As the qualifying day approached, her name began to surface in side conversations. At the shooting range, instructors would casually point to her stance as a good example, and once, during a strategy briefing, the lead sergeant referred to her run in the last sim as textbook cool under pressure. These were small acknowledgments, but in Mara's world, they were seismic. And yet Pharaoh remained the loudest voice in the room, reminding everyone in earshot that marksmen make marks with scopes, and anything else was a stunt for highlight reels. He once told another trainee, loud enough for Mara to hear, "She'll choke. They always do when it counts. Adrenaline doesn't care about ego." She internalized it all, not as pain, but as weight she was learning to carry without breaking, the kind of weight that carves endurance into your bones. When she wasn't training, she was visualizing each step of the course, each target, the recoil, the wind drift, even the tremor in her wrist after hour 7. She knew the qualifying gauntlet would last almost a full day, testing not just aim but stamina, discipline, and resolve. The final phase would include a surprise variable, hostile environment simulation with moving targets. For most, this was where precision optics would shine. For Mara, it would be the arena where her months of stripped-down elemental training would be baptized by fire. 3 nights before the run, She stood alone at the edge of the cliff that overlooked the training compound. The moon cast a soft shimmer across the rooftops and distant valleys. She took off her gloves, let the cold bite into her palms, and held the rifle up. Iron sight aligned with the blinking light of a comms tower miles away. No scope, no fallback, just breath, aim, and belief. She whispered one sentence into the night. "I'm ready to be seen for what I am." Then, slowly, she lowered the weapon, turned and walked back to the barracks with the silence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to herself. The last of the desert wind had died down by the time Celine returned to the barracks, her limbs heavy with the fatigue of constant drills, the dust clinging to her skin like a second layer. The tension from the previous weeks had not subsided, but her body had adapted to it, hardened by necessity and fueled by a growing determination that no longer sought validation but survival, and perhaps something more. She no longer viewed the training ground as a place of punishment or proof, but as a crucible, shaping her into someone she hadn't even imagined herself capable of becoming. As she removed her boots and leaned back on the cot that had grown oddly comforting despite its stiffness, Celine stared at the ceiling, her thoughts consumed by one thing: the final trial. It was approaching faster than any of them had anticipated, and unlike the rest of the training cycle, this wasn't something one could merely pass or fail. It was all or nothing. They called it the Gauntlet, an intensive 3-day simulation with live opponents, full battle objectives, unpredictable terrain, and randomized handicaps. Each candidate would be assigned a role at random, but there was one certainty: if you made it to the end, you were ready for anything the field would throw at you. No second chances. No support unless part of the simulation. No optics unless issued. Celine had no doubt she wouldn't be given a scope. Not after how the instructors had quietly followed her performance for the last month. She knew they wanted to see what would happen if she was finally forced into the one environment that would either cement her transformation or shatter her completely. And strangely, she was fine with that. The pressure didn't scare her anymore. The whispers of scope dependent were long gone, replaced by a silence that was louder than criticism, a silence that meant she was finally being taken seriously. But with that silence came eyes. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, the candidates were gathered at the field hangar, issued packs, simulation rounds, and randomized objectives. Celine's card was clipped to her gear like the others: squad support rifleman, iron sights only, objective, hold point alpha, and assist on extraction at point zeta. There was a flicker of pride that hit her when she saw the notation. No optics. It wasn't a punishment. It was a challenge, tailored specifically for her. They were daring her to do what she'd quietly been training for, silently improving, endlessly rehearsing. The terrain was brutal. Open desert interspersed with abandoned buildings, long canyon passes, and intermittent tree cover that offered more danger than safety. The simulation was rigged with sensors, tracking every move, every shot, every decision. Opponents were previous graduates of the program, tasked with testing the new batch to their limits. It began with a slow crawl toward the first objective, Celine's squad unaware of how many opponents were watching from afar. They were cautious, moving with textbook precision, but Celine sensed something the others didn't: patterns in the quiet, the rhythm of footsteps that weren't theirs, the flicker of movement just out of the corner of her vision. It was in that moment she realized that training with the iron sights had done more than refine her aim. It had rewired her instincts. Stripped of magnification, she had learned to read distances differently, anticipate movement in ways that scopes couldn't teach. She wasn't just aiming now, she was calculating everything: terrain, time, shadow angles, wind movement, and sound. The first encounter came hard and fast. A 4-man ambush from an elevated dune, triggered by a trip sensor the squad hadn't noticed. Celine didn't hesitate. While the others ducked for cover, she rolled beneath a rusted metal beam, and returned fire through a narrow slit between debris. No optics. No panic. Just breath control and perfect placement. 2 down. The third got a shot off before being flanked by another teammate. The fourth ran. Celine's iron sights followed him without strain. She waited. 1, 2. The wind caught his jacket. Trigger. 1 shot. He fell. The silence that followed was filled with static over the earpieces. Then, a crackled voice. Rider 2, confirmed 4 eliminations. Proceed to Alpha, but that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 days, Celine led her squad through choke points, improvised flanks, stealth maneuvers under moonless skies, and brutal hand-to-hand encounters when ammo ran dry. Every enemy they faced seemed more experienced, more prepared, yet it was Celine who always adapted. She didn't rely on equipment, she read the environment. And more importantly, she trusted herself. She didn't just survive, she outperformed. Word began to spread through the comms between instructors and previous graduates, monitoring the simulation. She's at 12. Then, she's at 17. And when she picked off 2 targets sprinting across opposite elevations in under 6 seconds, targets who themselves were decorated graduates, the murmur grew louder. At 23, the instructors began following her feed live, watching from a secure tent. They didn't interfere. They didn't have to. She was rewriting their expectations in real time. On the final stretch, exhausted and bleeding from a cut above her eye, Celine and her team reached Point Zeta. The extraction zone was guarded by a team of 5, none of whom were pulling punches. Celine gave the signal. 2 of her teammates advanced through the left flank, while she took a higher vantage point on a rocky bluff. No cover, no night vision, just shadows and instinct. They didn't expect her to come from above. By the time they heard her first shot, 1 had already fallen. 2 more turned to retaliate, but she was gone from the bluff and repositioned near the lower edge. Another breath. Another squeeze. The 4th target didn't even react before going down. The last one panicked and ran toward the extraction beacon, right into her line of fire. Shot number 25. A clean hit. They were done. The gauntlet was over, and the silence in the command tent was broken only by a quiet, disbelieving chuckle from the lead instructor. Iron sights. 25 confirmed. He turned to his aide. No one's ever done that without optics, not even close. And out in the distance, Celine stood quietly as the helicopter simulation swept in, her iron sight rifle still warm, her eyes scanning the horizon for any final surprises. Not because she doubted herself, but because she had learned that even after you make history, there's always another challenge on the horizon. The morning air hung thick with a charged stillness as Marin and her team reached the cliffside ridge overlooking Ashfall Canyon. The sun barely pierced through the overcast haze, casting an eerie sepia tone over the desolate terrain below. It had taken them days of tracking, maneuvering, and evading counter-recon to reach this precise vantage point undetected. According to satellite pings and intercepted comms, a warlord faction had established a fortified post on the canyon floor, shielding a rogue general who'd gone dark from his own army. The mission was clear: infiltrate the outpost, neutralize targets, extract sensitive intel. But things were never as simple as the briefings made them sound. The scouts who had returned from early recon already reported intense sniper activity and tech-dense defenses, thermal sensors, auto turrets, even tripwire drones. Most units would call for air support or wait for heavier backup, but Marin's squad wasn't most units, and they didn't have the luxury of time. Crouched behind a jagged boulder, Marin surveyed the enemy post through her binoculars. She could see the nested sentries patrolling in predictable sweeps and the high ground advantage offered by the observation towers. But what caught her attention more was the behavior of her own squad. Micah was unusually quiet, his breathing short. Even Skell, typically the team's sarcastic optimist, had gone mute. She could feel it too, the weight of expectation crushing down on them. This wasn't just another operation. It was her first real command after being mocked, doubted, and dismissed as, quote, scope-dependent. One mistake, one miscalculation, and it wouldn't be just her reputation on the line. It would be their lives. She clicked off the safety on her rifle, the iron sights gleaming dully in the low light. No scope, no margin for error. She knew eyes were on her, not just from the enemy below, but from her own people beside her. They needed more than orders. They needed conviction, clarity, and courage. Marin drew in a breath and tapped her earpiece. Quietly, she gave the command to split into 3 groups. One to breach from the south under cover of night, one to plant jammers near the perimeter, and one, her group, to ascend silently down the west ridge to take out the tower guards. She would lead the western flank herself. The descent was punishing. Gravel slipped beneath boots, and the wind howled like a warning as they navigated the exposed rock face. One wrong step, and the whole mission would spiral into chaos. Marin's heart pounded, but her hands were steady. The iron sights aligned as she locked onto a sentry sweeping the ridge below. A single breath, one shot, and he dropped before he could radio in. No flash, no noise. Just precision. It wasn't flashy, but it was efficient. The kind of kill that didn't need praise, because it kept her people alive. As they reached the canyon floor, the comms crackled. Group B had successfully disrupted the surveillance field. The tripwire drones flickered out one by one, and the auto turrets rotated to default standby mode. The timing was perfect, and now Group A had a clean path to the southern breach. But the real challenge lay ahead. The towers. Taking them out meant climbing silently in the open, disabling guards before they could trigger alarms, and doing it all while moving as one fluid unit. Marin took point, gesturing signals that required no words. The squad followed, their trust in her absolute now, earned through grit and unflinching leadership. The first tower loomed like a steel beast, guarded by 2 high-caliber gunners and a third inside manning thermal scans. Marin circled the base, her breath shallow, the iron sights lining up again. No second chances. The shot rang, clean through the helmet of the outer guard. The second dropped before his scream could escape. Then she stormed the staircase in a blur, shoulder-checking the door open and sweeping left. The man inside reached for the trigger. Too late. Another clean shot. 3 down. No scope, no spotlight, just skill. By the time they neutralized the second and third towers, her kill count had risen to 12. Wordless awe radiated from her team as they moved with a rhythm that only battle-born trust could form. But Marin wasn't counting kills. She was calculating every angle, every corner where a mistake might live. Her mission wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about finishing what they started. They converged on the inner compound as Group A secured the southern breach. The target was holed up in the bunker below the communications array, guarded by elite mercs and laser-triggered traps. Time was against them. The longer they lingered, the higher the chance of reinforcements. Marin coordinated the breach with razor precision. She didn't wait, didn't hesitate. With her rifle in hand, iron sights steady, she became the lead force. Clearing the hallway, dropping guards with minimal movement, each shot a ballet of intent and instinct. As they pushed deeper, the resistance thickened. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, flashbangs rocked the narrow corridors, and screams echoed in the metallic silence. But Marin never missed. Shot after shot, 17, 19, 21. Her squad flanked the final control room while she took point, firing blind into suppressive fire without even a reflex optic to assist. And still, 23. Then came the showdown. The rogue general himself, flanked by 2 armored bodyguards, attempted to flee through the underground loading bay. Marin sprinted forward without pause, rolling beneath gunfire, springing up with the rifle raised, iron sights aligned. A breath, a blink, and the first guard fell. She pivoted, caught the second square in the jaw, and finally, with the general cornered, his weapon raised to bargain, she steadied her aim. 25. The shot echoed not as an end but as a declaration. Marin lowered her rifle as the silence settled. Her heart thundered against her ribs. Behind her, her squad stood motionless, not because they were shocked, but because they finally saw her for what she truly was: a leader, a tactician. A warrior whose skill didn't rely on optics, but on vision, the kind you earn through adversity. And somewhere in that breathless moment, Marin knew something had changed. Not just in their mission, not just in how others saw her, but in herself. She didn't need a scope to see that clearly. Even as her name began to carry weight in whispers and stunned recollections, Bryn didn't feel like a legend. Her modest apartment, where medals hung beside unpaid bills and her gear leaned quietly in the corner, reminded her of the reality behind every online montage and compilation clip that fans were now putting together. The gaming world was hailing her as Iron Wraith, a nickname someone coined after a stream clip went viral of her making 3 precision kills while barely moving from cover, all using iron sights. But Bryn knew that fame was fleeting, and, more importantly, that it didn't heal old scars or quiet the inner critic that had long been her shadow. After the tournament, her inbox was flooded with collaboration requests, brand offers, and interview invites. Her DMs were filled with everything from marriage proposals to death threats. Yet in the middle of all the noise, she found herself clinging to the quiet. It was in those moments of silence, when the lights were off and she was alone with her thoughts, that she processed what had just unfolded and what it meant for the person she had become. She wasn't trying to be a symbol. She had just been trying to prove to herself that she wasn't weak, that she could be trusted in the moment when everything was on the line, that all those years of being underestimated hadn't been for nothing. The next few days were a whirlwind. Her team, Ghost Ember, was offered sponsorships from 2 major tech brands and a military-grade peripheral company. Bryn was flown to Los Angeles for a photo shoot, where they dressed her in tactical cosplay and asked her to pose with a prop rifle. She smiled for the camera, but something felt off. She didn't play for the cameras, for the gear, or for the spectacle. She played for the stillness in the storm, the moment of clarity when a match hung in the balance and all the noise dropped away. Fame had its uses, though. One evening, her old coach from the local youth center where she had first learned how to hold a controller called her up. He was crying. Said the kids were inspired. Said donations had come in from people who had never cared about their little corner of the city. Said Bryn had given them something they hadn't had in years: hope. That hit harder than any kill streak. That night, Bryn dug out her old journal, the one she used to scribble in when no one believed in her, and she wrote something simple on the last page. This time, I did not flinch. But success came with a price. Her former squadmates, some of whom had mocked her for playing without a scope, some of whom had called her a liability, now suddenly wanted to reconnect. A few tried to apologize. Others acted like they'd always known she'd make it. Bryn didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because she no longer felt she needed their validation. That version of her, the one desperate to be seen and heard, had been left behind in the dust of the stadium floor. One day, while testing out a new headset from a sponsor, Bryn logged into a lower-tier server just to relax. She was matched with a group of younger players, all with clunky communication, low-rank tags, and avatars that screamed beginner energy. She stayed silent at first, watching them scramble and fumble over tactics, but then she noticed something: the determination. The way they covered each other, the way they laughed off mistakes, the way one of them whispered, "We got this," even after their team was down 5 points. Bryn joined the comms. She didn't tell them who she was, didn't mention the 25-kill game or the tournament. She just played. With no overlays, no fanfare, no pressure, And when one of the kids made a perfect flank that led to a team wipe, she smiled and said, "That was clean. You've got good instincts." The kid giggled. "Thanks. We're trying to be like Iron Wraith." Bryn froze for a beat, then chuckled. "She'd be proud," she said. When the match ended, she logged off quietly. There was something deeply comforting about knowing her story was out there, reshaping others, even when she wasn't in the room. Back at home, she received a call from Naira, her old rival. Naira had been quiet since the tournament loss, but now her tone was warm, almost relieved. "I misjudged you," she admitted, "and I think I want to learn how to play without a scope." Bryn didn't gloat. She simply offered to share a few drills. Not long after, they began practicing together, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging strategies. It wasn't about rivalry anymore. It was about respect. About knowing that you can fight someone and still grow from what they teach you. Bryn's world was no longer defined by bitterness, revenge, or needing to prove something. It was now about legacy. Helping the next girl who picked up a controller in her bedroom, afraid to speak on comms, afraid to miss a shot. Helping her stand tall. Helping her play anyway. And maybe, just maybe, helping her reach the moment when the world stops calling her scope-dependent and starts calling her dangerous, capable, undeniable. The crowd erupted into a roar that shook the training compound as the final target dropped, her iron sight steady even as the dust of the battlefield still clung to her boots. In that moment, Liv wasn't just a sniper. She wasn't just the girl who had once missed a standing target at 20 yards, or the one they had labeled scope-dependent in derision. She had become something else entirely, a symbol of what grit looked like when skill met perseverance under pressure. The scoreboard lit up with her call sign, Sparrow, next to an almost unbelievable number. 25 confirmed precision hits, all within the iron sight division, a record that hadn't just been unbeaten, but had been previously thought unattainable in that year's Elite Apex Challenge. But that moment wasn't just about numbers or bragging rights. It was the culmination of every night she had spent quietly recalibrating her mind and body, every morning she had trained when no one else was watching, and every ounce of pain she had felt while shouldering the weight of underestimation. As she stood there, surrounded by murmurs of disbelief turning into chants of respect, Liv felt the full gravity of what had just unfolded. Coach Brandt, who had once doubted whether she belonged on the field without a high-tech optic, stepped forward, his usually hard eyes softening, nodding once in solemn respect. There were no grand speeches, no congratulations that could fully capture what she had just accomplished. But Liv didn't need them. She had heard it all before, every criticism, every underhanded joke, every suggestion that she'd never make it without crutches like scopes or spotters. And she had rewritten all of that with the quiet authority of performance, not posturing. Across the tarmac, her father stood among the crowd, his hand gripping the rail, knuckles white, his eyes brimming. He had seen her fall, he had seen her quit, and he had watched her come back, slowly, painfully, alone for much of the journey. Now he stood as witness to the transformation, not of a soldier into a champion, but of a daughter into a force of will the world could no longer ignore. Even Miles, who had held that record for 4 years and had barely acknowledged her in training, approached her. He extended a hand, awkward, unsure, but sincere. "Iron sights, huh?" he muttered, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Liv shook his hand, her grip steady. "Iron will," she replied simply. And then she walked past him, not out of pride, but because she knew her journey didn't end with validation. This was just a checkpoint. Later that evening, in the post-competition debrief, analysts pored over her performance footage. Every shot was dissected frame by frame, her posture, her breath control, her target acquisition. The conclusion was unanimous. She hadn't gotten lucky. Liv had mastered a level of intuitive marksmanship, that had made every hit feel like a prediction rather than a reaction. There were no wasted movements, no second guesses. She was a sniper, in the purest form, stripped of tech and still surgical. In the lounge area, the chatter buzzed like static, filled with words like unprecedented, next-gen talent, and Iron Queen. But Liv sat apart, on a quiet bench, with a single protein bar in her hand, the weight of adrenaline fading into fatigue. Sasha slid onto the bench beside her without a word, holding out a bottle of water. They didn't need to talk. They both knew what this meant, not just for Liv, but for every recruit who had ever been told they weren't enough. Sasha's grin said everything Liv couldn't yet put into words. Over the next few weeks, requests for interviews poured in. Tactical magazines wanted cover features. Training schools requested her appearance at seminars. Sponsors reached out with gear endorsements, most ironically offering top-of-the-line scopes with her name engraved. She turned most of them down. Not out of spite, but because this wasn't about building a brand. It was about staying true to what got her there, her refusal to lean on anything she hadn't earned. Instead, she began working quietly on a project with the Academy, a program for young sharpshooters from underfunded communities, giving them access to resources, training, and most importantly, mentors who wouldn't judge them by their tools. Her first class was small, just 8 students, but as she stood in front of them, she recognized the same fire in their eyes she once saw in the mirror. She told them her story, not the glamorous version, but the one filled with doubt and grind and falling so many times you forget what standing feels like. And when one of the kids asked if they needed the best gear to succeed, she smiled. "You don't need perfect tools, you need precision. And that starts here," she said, tapping her temple. The journey that had begun with mockery, detoured through failure, and climaxed with triumph, was no longer just Liv's. It had become a blueprint for those who would come next, not to follow in her footsteps but to find their own. That night, as she returned to her small Spartan room and laid her gear down, she ran her fingers over the scratched iron sight she had refused to replace. It was worn, chipped, and unremarkable. But it had carried her further than any fancy optic ever could. It had forced her to see with clarity when everything else blurred. And in that clarity, Liv had finally found not just her aim, but herself. The chatter in the barracks had changed. No longer was Mara the butt of every joke or the center of dismissive glances. Now, her name was spoken with an edge of curiosity, sometimes even admiration, although rarely in front of her face. After her performance in the qualifying skirmishes, where she dismantled expectations with nothing but iron sights and resolve, something shifted. It wasn't just among her peers, it was in the way her commanding officers looked at her, as if suddenly recognizing a weapon they had overlooked on the rack for too long. But even with all that, Mara didn't let it sink in. She kept her head down, trained harder, and spoke little. She had tasted respect, yes, but not fulfillment, because something deep inside her whispered that her story was far from over, and that the coming mission wasn't just another opportunity. It was the culmination of every bruise, every slight, every ounce of restraint and discipline she had shown. The mission was codenamed Operation Hollow Gate, a joint international strike against a highly entrenched militia that had seized control of a mountain complex in the outlands of Kesari province. Intelligence revealed multiple hostage situations, fortified enemy positions, and minimal chance for drone or air support due to anti-air emplacements and environmental interference. The brass needed skilled infantry for this one, and only those with top scores from the recent simulations and skirmishes would be considered. Mara made the list. Not barely. She was near the top. That fact alone left some of her rivals with clenched jaws and hollow stares. And yet, no one could argue. Her kills, her efficiency, and her discipline in the field were clean, efficient, undeniable. When the mission briefing came through, Mara didn't blink. She read every line of the dossier like it was scripture. Each map grid, every known patrol route, and even the psychological profiles of the enemy leadership. She memorized it all. Not because she wanted to impress, but because knowledge was survival, and survival wasn't optional. What intrigued her most, however, was that the enemy held the high ground, literally and tactically. No scopes would be reliable in the shifting mists of the Kasari Peaks. That meant mid to close combat. That meant instinct, reflex, and raw aim. Iron Sight's territory, her territory. The days leading up to deployment were quiet ones. Mara didn't celebrate. She trained. She ran obstacle courses with weighted gear. She practiced reloads blindfolded. She meditated until her thoughts slowed into silence. One night, while disassembling and reassembling her rifle for the third time, her squadmate Rafi leaned over and asked, almost sheepishly, if she would mind teaching him how she managed such tight groupings without a scope. For a second, Mara thought it might be a joke, but when she met his eyes, she saw no mockery, just sincerity and maybe, for the first time, respect. She nodded. That night, she didn't just teach Rafi. She ended up with half the squad watching her as she demonstrated breathing control, trigger discipline, and how to align with iron sights using nothing but a flicker of intuition and peripheral geometry. They listened, they asked questions, and nobody called her scope-dependent. Deployment came before dawn. The team moved in via halo jump, skimming just beneath radar detection. The cold hit like a hammer the moment they breached the stratosphere's edge. But Mara didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked ahead, heart steady, body primed. The descent was smooth, the landing rough, but within acceptable margins. As they moved through the first ravine, tensions mounted, not from fear, but from anticipation. The enemy knew they were coming. Every crunch of gravel underfoot, every breath caught in the lungs, felt like a countdown. It wasn't long before they made contact. A tripwire alarm at the edge of a frozen outpost signaled their presence. Gunfire followed. Chaos bloomed in seconds, sharp and ruthless. And that was when Mara entered what some later would call her state, a zone of hyperfocus, where nothing existed but angles, shadows, and breath. She dropped 3 enemy scouts before the first of her teammates could call out positions. No scope. No hesitation. Her rifle moved with precision. Each shot a whisper of finality. When a sniper tried to flank from a ridge, she ducked behind cover, calculated the arc, and fired a round that dropped him before his trigger could tighten. No optics. Just steel and instinct. The terrain was brutal. Icy switchbacks, rock slides, and narrow ledges made movement a dance of calculated risk. But Mara adapted. She led from the middle, covering blind spots, calling out changes, using the environment like she'd grown up in those mountains. Hours passed like minutes. Hostile encounters bled into each other. Still, she moved forward, her body bruised, her knuckles scraped raw from gripping cold steel too long. But the fire in her chest never dimmed. They breached the compound by nightfall. The final standoff was inside the inner sanctum, a maze of dim tunnels and dimmer morality. Hostages were wired with explosives. The enemy had nothing to lose. That was when Mara made a call that no one expected. She volunteered to split from the main group and clear the west wing alone to prevent a crossfire that could have killed innocents. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but her reasoning was simple. She was the most accurate in close quarters without tech reliance. The iron sights wouldn't fog. Her judgment wouldn't waver. And so she went, alone into the dark. What followed would later be dissected in training simulations and after-action reports, but nothing written could quite capture what happened in that hour. She neutralized 12 targets in under 9 minutes, each with a single shot. No wasted rounds. No hesitation. She defused 2 bomb vests with shaking hands and a steady breath. And when she emerged at the rendezvous point, covered in sweat and blood, not all of it hers, she reported in with a voice calm as stone. 25 confirmed kills by mission's end. Not one with a scope, not one with aid, just her training, and iron. The legend of Keira Langley was no longer whispered. It was documented, celebrated, and in some quarters, feared. Despite the monumental shift in how she was now perceived, Elara didn't let her newfound respect cloud her discipline. While many others would have used such fame as a stepping stone to relax or bask in their victory, she only sharpened her edges further. The kill count, the accolades, the silence of those who once laughed, none of it distracted her from the real mission. She had become more than a sniper, more than a soldier. She had become a living challenge to the assumptions that governed every corner of their military structure. She was proof that reliance on technology could be reimagined, that instincts and training, when paired with raw determination, could rival any digital scope or enhanced targeting system. In the days following the operation, Command was eager to pull her into debriefings. They dissected every second of her helmet cam footage, mapped each movement she made, and tried to understand how she achieved such precision without the crutch of technology. They even brought in specialists to analyze her posture, her timing, and her tracking methods. Some assumed it was luck. Others suggested she had some form of synesthesia or photographic memory. But the truth was simpler and far more unsettling to those who had placed their faith entirely in gear and gadgets. She had trained herself to see in ways they had forgotten were possible. Her eyes weren't machines, but they were disciplined and fast. Her hands weren't guided by algorithms, but by intuition refined through hours of failure and correction. Her awareness wasn't programmed. It was earned. There was a particular briefing where one of the senior analysts tried to explain away her performance using models and probability matrices, suggesting that the combination of low visibility and enemy patterns made it a statistically manageable engagement. Elara didn't laugh. She didn't argue. She simply asked him one question: why didn't anyone else do it then? The room fell silent. She hadn't meant to shame anyone. She wasn't there to make others feel lesser, but her presence challenged everyone. Even now, as she stood in the training fields with new recruits, watching her every move, she carried that weight. They weren't just learning marksmanship from her. They were studying a myth brought to life. Many of them were eager to replicate her method, tossing away their scopes in hopes of capturing some of her magic. But Elara was quick to ground them. It wasn't the lack of a scope that made her exceptional, it was the presence of persistence. She drilled this into them relentlessly. The scope was not the enemy, dependency was. If they could use technology as an aid, great, but if they couldn't function without it, they weren't soldiers. They were spectators with expensive toys. Slowly, her approach began reshaping parts of the training program. Units previously obsessed with gear optimization started introducing basic sight exercises. Simulations were designed to test reflexes without visual assists. Veterans who had once dismissed her quietly asked for sessions, disguised as joint exercises, to save face. And through it all, Elara remained centered, never boasting, never capitalizing on her influence. One evening, long after the sun dipped behind the western cliffs of the base, she sat alone at the firing range, reassembling her iron sight rifle. The quiet between shots was something she cherished now. No crowd, no analysts, just her and the mechanics of a tool that had once been seen as inferior. That night, Commander Vance approached her, not as an officer delivering orders, but as a peer acknowledging something deeper. He sat beside her in silence at first, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he told her what had been circulating through the upper ranks. Her mission footage and after-action report had reached the Central Combat Doctrine Council, the same council responsible for approving and revising tactical approaches across the armed forces. Word was they were strongly considering a revision of field doctrine regarding optics training and sensory adaptation. In short, Elara's method might soon become standard. The magnitude of it didn't hit her immediately. She nodded, quietly thanked him, and resumed checking her rifle's alignment. But hours later, alone in her bunk, it dawned on her. She wasn't just a response to criticism anymore. She had become the catalyst for institutional change. Still, Ilara didn't allow herself to celebrate too much. For every shift in doctrine there would be resistance. There would be soldiers who clung to the old ways, who resented the symbol she had become. Some had already started calling her the Iron Ghost behind her back, meant as both a compliment and a jab, but Ilara didn't care about nicknames anymore. Let them call her what they wanted. Scope-dependent, Iron Ghost, lucky, outdated, none of it mattered. Because when the next mission came, and it always came, she would be ready, scope or no scope. She would see the target. She would hear the terrain. She would feel the shot before she ever pulled the trigger. And most of all, she would carry with her the quiet fire of someone who had been doubted, dismissed, and underestimated, and who had turned that doubt into something unbreakable. Her war wasn't over. It had just evolved. The war game had ended, but its echoes lingered long after the final report. Avery's 25 confirmed iron sight eliminations had already gone viral on the base's private feed, where soldiers traded clips and bragging rights like currency. But for Avery, it wasn't about the views or the temporary fame that came with outperforming every other participant. It was about something deeper, something that even she couldn't fully put into words. It was about standing in her truth, holding her ground when the wind had howled and the tide pushed against her, and walking through it without losing herself. When the senior officers called her into the strategy hall one last time before she would return home, she expected another round of congratulations. Instead, she was met with a formal document. She'd been offered a mentorship position, not just a promotion, but a role that would let her train other soldiers in precision under pressure, regardless of what equipment they had. She stared at the paper for a long moment, overwhelmed. This wasn't just an honor, it was a statement, a signal that what she had done wasn't a fluke, wasn't a PR stunt, but a new standard. The same commanders who once echoed the, quote, scope-dependent label behind closed doors were now trusting her with their next generation. She thought back to her first days at camp, the whispered jokes, the shaking heads when she refused attachments on her rifle. She thought about Des, her bunkmate, who had watched her silently, perhaps uncertain whether Avery's fight was stubbornness or something more. And she thought of her father, of all people, his crooked smile and careful encouragement, the way he told her stories about precision over power when she was still learning to hold a brush, not a weapon. Her entire life had moved like this, people underestimating her until they couldn't anymore. Avery accepted the position with a steady hand and left the hall to find Des waiting outside. Des didn't say anything at first. She just handed Avery a patched-up replica of the iron sight rifle from the simulation. Someone had salvaged it from the sim room, spray-painted 25 along the stock, and signed it with the words, Unscoped Legend. Avery laughed, the sound low but full. The two of them sat on the bench outside the mess hall, the air quiet except for the faint buzz of late-evening drills in the distance. She felt something loosen in her chest, not the need to prove herself, not anymore, but the need to carry the weight of all those doubts. She didn't have to, not now. News of her achievement continued to ripple out. Veterans reached out privately, including a few known snipers who told her they respected her for doing what they never had the patience to master. One of them wrote, "It takes more guts to go into the fire with less and still come out with more." But it wasn't the attention she clung to. It was the small, nearly invisible changes happening within the camp. Recruits who once mimicked trends now asked her about balance, breath, windage. She caught one group practicing with iron sights in the early hours before drills, mimicking the techniques they'd seen her use. Some called it the Avery method. Others just called it getting better. Even her critics softened. Chief Morales, once her harshest trainer, approached her during a camp inspection and said, "You made me rethink everything I thought I knew about reliance." It wasn't an apology, but Avery never needed one. It was enough to know she had changed minds, not with arguments, but with action. As her final week in the field approached, she spent time not in ceremony, but in preparation. writing training manuals, recording visual guides, and helping struggling cadets find their rhythm. Her influence was quiet, but present, stitched into the camp's new rhythm. On her last day, the camp organized a send-off. Nothing flashy, just a simple gathering, a modest meal, and a group of people who now saw her not as the girl with the handicap, but as a leader who had reshaped the game. A hologram replayed clips from her simulation run, the audience collectively holding its breath as each shot landed. Avery didn't linger on the past. Instead, she offered a short impromptu speech. Your tools don't define your limits. Your limits begin the moment you let other people measure your worth. The applause was brief but sincere. She left that night with her head high and her feet steady, already thinking about what came next. She was returning home not just as a soldier, but as a symbol. Someone who had faced down ridicule, remained true to her principles, and proved that clarity of vision didn't require a scope. Weeks later, her story made it into broader media, an interview here, a feature there, but she turned most of them down. The attention wasn't the goal. What mattered most was the ripple effect. In a small training camp overseas, a new recruit tightened the strap of her helmet and whispered, "If Avery could do it, so can I." Before stepping into her first simulation, unscoped and unafraid. Avery's legacy wasn't carved into stone. It was carried in the breath of those who followed, in the quiet confidence of every person who chose precision over pretense, who believed that even when the world handed them less, they could still give more. And in the end, that was more than enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.